When Gavin called to invite me on a celebration cruise, I wanted so badly to believe it was genuine. He said they wanted to toast my recovery from surgery. Just the three of us. It had been weeks since I'd seen him, and since Robert's death 2 years ago, the distance between us had only grown. I told myself this might be the moment when my son finally remembered what family meant. That morning, I chose my navy dress, the one Robert always said made my eyes shine, and slipped on a pearl brooch he'd given me on our 30th anniversary. In the mirror, I looked older, thinner, but still the woman who had once kept a household running, paid tuition bills, and signed over our Beacon Hill townhouse so Gavin and Claudia could have a home of their own. I even thought of the $3 million I had invested in Gavin's consulting venture last year, and how naive it might have been, yet I clung to hope. The yacht was moored in Gloucester, gleaming white under the late morning sun. Gavin hugged me on the dock, though it felt rehearsed. Claudia, waiting on the deck, smiled too broadly, her gaze sliding past me. Still, I followed them aboard, telling myself to quiet the unease gnawing at me. For the first hour, it felt almost normal. We sipped mimosas, watched the shoreline shrink behind us. Then Gavin steered the conversation toward my will. Probate can be so complicated. Mom, he said, pouring me more champagne. Claudia, phone in hand, pretended to take selfies, but I saw the lens angled toward me. My words, my glass, my hesitation all recorded. When I set my drink aside and told them I'd had enough, Gavin's smile faltered. Claudia stepped closer, her perfume sharp in the sea air. She leaned to my ear and whispered, "Say hi to the sharks," before giving the smallest push. The sky vanished. Cold Atlantic swallowed me whole. Above the rush of water, I heard Gavin shouting, "Mom, oh God." Mom, his voice breaking like a performance for an unseen audience. But I knew better. They didn't want me rescued. They wanted me gone. And they wanted my 120 million. The cold struck first, a shock that stole my breath and numbed my limbs. I kicked hard, forcing my head above water long enough to gasp before another wave dragged me under. My hip throbbed where the surgery scar pulled against the strain. I thought of Robert, then his steady hand beside me during our morning laps in the community pool, and clung to that rhythm. Stroke, kick, surface, breathe. When my strength faltered, I spotted a speck against the gray horizon, a fishing boat. I forced my arm upward, waving with what little strength remained. The vessel veered toward me, and two shapes leaned over the rail. Moments later, calloused hands and a wiry teenager's grip pulled me into the boat like a half-drowned fish. Holy hell. Lady, the older man said, breathless from the effort. What happened to you? I could barely speak through chattering teeth. Yacht, my family. He didn't press. He draped a coarse blanket over my shoulders, its scent of salt and engine oil both foreign and strangely comforting. His grandson, no more than 16, steered us back toward shore while the man studied me with narrowed eyes. "Name's Eli Moran," he said. "This here's Tyler. We'll radio the Coast Guard know." My voice cracked but was firm. "Please don't. Not yet." He frowned. "Ma'am, you nearly drowned. I know. But if you tell them, my son will know I'm alive. He needs to think I'm gone. It's the only way I can stop him." Something in my tone must have convinced him. Eli rubbed his chin, then gave a single nod. "All right. You dry off. We'll say nothing." Wrapped in that blanket, shivering, but alive, I stared back at the fading line of the yacht disappearing toward Boston. They thought the ocean had finished what they started. Let them believe it. For the first time since Robert's death, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't powerless. I had something Gavin and Claudia could never imagine: the invisibility of the dead. And with that came the freedom to act without their guard. I tightened the blanket around my shoulders and whispered to myself, they wanted me erased. Now I'll write the ending. 4 days after the yacht, I stood in the shadows of Mount Auburn Cemetery, the oldest landscaped burial ground in Cambridge, hidden behind a stand of maples. The November air was sharp, but the chill inside me had nothing to do with the weather. Through borrowed binoculars, I watched a crowd gather around a polished mahogany casket that, I knew, was empty. Gavin and Claudia stood at the center like actors on a stage. Their clothes matched perfectly, he in a tailored black suit, she in a fitted dress with a black veil that fluttered as if grief itself had chosen to accessorize her. Claudia dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, pausing just long enough for everyone to notice. Gavin placed a hand on her shoulder, his face solemn in the way of a man who wanted the world to see his loss. And the world believed him. I saw my neighbor Eleanor clutch a tissue, her shoulders shaking. Members of my old book club stood in a small cluster, whispering condolences. Dr. Hayworth, who had treated me after Robert passed, lowered his head respectfully. To them, I wasn't Selena Harwood, survivor of betrayal. I was the fragile widow with failing memory who had tragically slipped into the sea. The lie worked beautifully, yet something unsettled me. Among the crowd of mourners, certain faces were absent. Patricia Lang, my attorney of 20 years, always said she would be there to the very end. Richard Bellamy, my financial advisor, who had been a fixture at our Christmas dinners. Neither had come, not even a wreath in their names. Why out of town, or something worse that they knew the truth, and chose silence? I lowered the binoculars and tried to steady my breathing. Every performance leaves traces. Gavin and Claudia had staged this theater with meticulous care, but loose threads were showing. If my own trusted advisors were missing, then perhaps the betrayal ran deeper than I wanted to imagine. Across the cemetery, the minister's voice carried in the breeze, reading words of farewell meant for me. I felt no sorrow, only a tightening resolve. My enemies thought they had written the ending of my story. All they had really done was give me a front row seat to their lies. As the mourners began to disperse, I slipped back from the trees, already planning my next move, because watching them bury an empty casket had given me more than grief, it had given me suspicion. The streets of Beacon Hill were silent when I stepped out of the cab, 3 blocks from my former townhouse. Gas lamps flickered faintly against the brick facades, their glow catching on the black iron fences and shuttered windows. I pulled my coat tighter and walked slowly, every step an ache of memory. I had lived in that house for 35 years, raised Gavin there, hosted Christmas dinners, and tended roses in the narrow garden out back. It had been mine until the day I handed over the deed, believing my son would cherish it as I had. The brass key in my pocket felt heavier than it should. Gavin had never asked for it back, certain I wouldn't dare intrude. He had underestimated me. I circled to the garden gate, slipped through, and found the back door. The lock turned easily, as if the house itself hadn't given up on me yet. Inside, the air was still, with a faint trace of polish. White sheets covered most of the furniture, but there were fresh footprints in the dust by the hall rug, and the refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen. This wasn't an abandoned property. Someone was here often enough to keep it alive. I moved toward Robert's old study, my heart hammering. The room had been his sanctuary, a place of order and precision. Now the desk was covered with neat stacks of papers, and on the middle shelf sat a row of binders with a label printed in block letters. Project Harwood. I opened one. Inside were photographs me at Gavin's birthday dinner last year, looking startled because no one had warned me it was a surprise party. The caption underneath read, "Disoriented, confused. Another photo showed me in the hospital after surgery. Eyes closed. A chart marked memory lapse attached. Every image was twisted, framed to prove a narrative I now understood too well. Further back, I found medical notes stamped with forged signatures, reports of supposed dementia symptoms I had never experienced, and at the bottom drafts of a new will, leaving everything not just to Gavin, but to any future child of Gavin Harwood and Claudia Mercer. Harwood. I closed the binder, my hands trembling. My own name had been turned into a project for elimination, and somewhere in that house, the evidence of how far they'd go was only beginning to surface. I had nearly reached the back door when a sound cut through the silence. A thin, plaintive wail drifting down the hallway. I froze, every nerve alight. A baby. The cry rose again, muffled but unmistakable, coming from the second floor. My mind reeled. Gavin and Claudia had never spoken of children, insisting they were too focused on their careers. Now, in the very house where they plotted my disappearance, there was an infant. I pressed my back against the wall, straining to listen. Footsteps creaked above me, followed by a woman's voice humming softly. Not Claudia's voice. A nurse. Perhaps. My pulse thundered in my ears. I slipped out the door and into the garden, forcing myself to move slowly. Quietly. The baby's cry lingered in my chest long after the sound faded behind the closed door. It wasn't joy or pride that gripped me. It was dread. 2 nights later, in the dim back room of Grace Chen's inn, I told everything to Noah Crawford, the private investigator Grace insisted I meet. A former Boston detective with a careful manner, he listened without interruption, jotting notes as I described the binders, the photographs. And finally, the cry that had rattled me more than the cold Atlantic ever had. Noah leaned back, exhaling slowly. Claudia's name surfaced once before in a quiet inquiry. I ran, he said, Boston Clinic? High-end surrogacy arrangements? I thought nothing of it then. He returned the next evening with files. Lila Morris, 17, from Bangor, Maine, vanished from her foster placement last year. The clinic records list her as the birth mother. Delivery 3 weeks ago. Cause of death complications. He tapped the page, his voice low. Every nurse I've spoken to says she was healthy. No warning signs. I stared at the grainy photo of a girl with solemn eyes and a shy smile. My throat tightened. A child had carried life into the world, only to lose her own. And now Gavin and Claudia held that life in their hands, presenting him as their heir, their proof of continuity. But to me, the truth was clear. That baby was not evidence of legacy. He was evidence of a crime. Grace Chen's inn sat tucked on a side street in Gloucester, an unassuming clapboard house with lace curtains and the smell of ginger tea drifting from the kitchen. She had run it for decades. No questions asked. Cash only. I was grateful for her quiet protection, though I knew simply hiding wouldn't be enough. My son and his wife had built a story that erased me. I would need more than survival to dismantle it. Noah Crawford met me there after dark, carrying a folder thick with documents. He spread them across the dining table where Grace once served her guests. Payment ledgers from the surrogacy clinic, copies of forged medical notes, and legal drafts Claudia's ally had helped prepare. Each sheet of paper was a piece of the puzzle, and together they painted a picture far uglier than I had imagined. They've been moving assets for months, Noah said, his finger tracing a line of transfers from my accounts. Claudia's using a lawyer named Thomas Keating. He specializes in trust restructuring. He's already drafted provisions for a child heir. I studied the pages, anger hardening into something sharper. They hadn't just plotted my death. They had planned for a baby's future as if he were a pawn on a chessboard. purchased to seal their claim. Grace placed a cup of tea by my elbow. "You can't fight them with anger alone," she said. "They have the law on their side. You need to make them falter." Her words settled in me like a spark. Strength didn't always come from brute force. Sometimes it came from unease, from doubt, gnawing at a person until they destroyed themselves. I realized I didn't need to confront Gavin and Claudia with everything at once. What I needed was to let them see me alive, but uncertain of what I knew. Fear would do the rest. That night, I wrote on heavy stationery Robert had once favored for his business letters. My hand trembled only once as I shaped the words, "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. We need to talk. Love, Mom." When I sealed the envelope, a strange calm washed over me. Tomorrow, the dead would speak, and my children would no longer sleep easy. The house smelled the same as it always had: polish and faint lavender from the garden I once tended. I sat in my old armchair by the window, the one Robert had given me on our 20th anniversary, and waited. The infant lay in my arms, soft and warm, his dark eyes searching my face as if he knew something was out of place. Grace had arranged for the nurse to step out, giving me a quiet hour. I heard the key in the lock before the door opened. Gavin entered first, his suit jacket half off, keys still in hand. Claudia followed, her voice bright with triumph as she said something about probate filings. Then she saw me. The scream that tore from her throat was raw, instinctive. Gavin froze in the doorway, his face draining of color. For a moment, silence filled the room except for the baby's steady breathing. "Hello, darlings," I said, stroking the child's hair. "You look surprised." Claudia clutched Gavin's arm. She's supposed to be dead." "I finished for her." "Yes? I've read the obituary. Quite the performance." Gavin stepped forward, his voice hoarse. "Mom." "What? How I survived isn't the question," I said. "The question is why my son stood by while his wife shoved me into the Atlantic, and why there's a baby here I was never told about." Claudia's lips tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" I shifted the baby gently, feeling the recorder in my pocket catch every word. Forged medical reports, staged photographs, documents prepared to make me look incompetent. "Do you deny it?" Gavin's eyes flickered, torn between denial and something like guilt. "We were just trying to protect the estate," he muttered. "Protect it from whom?" "From me," Claudia's composure snapped. "You should have signed the papers when we asked. It would have been easier for everyone." Her words hung heavy in the air. I let the silence stretch, knowing the recorder had captured exactly what I needed. The baby stirred in my arms, and I held him closer. My voice was steady when I said, "This is only the beginning." Noah worked with the efficiency of a man who had spent years setting traps for liars. He planted small recording devices in the living room and study, tucking them behind frames and under shelves. Grace stayed upstairs with the baby, her calm presence a comfort I clung to, even as the weight of what we were about to do pressed down on me. That evening, I called Gavin and Claudia back to the house. I told them simply that we needed to talk, nothing more. They arrived quickly, suspicion written in the set of their shoulders, but greed burning bright enough to draw them in. Claudia was the first to speak. "You think you can scare us? You have nothing." I leaned back in my chair, watching her. "Nothing. I have photographs, notes, copies of forged documents. I have more than you think." Her laugh was sharp, brittle. "Prove it." The word echoed in the room, and I felt the recorder hum in my pocket as if it were alive, feeding on her arrogance. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let silence stretch, the kind that forces people to fill it with their own words. Gavin shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his sleeve. "You don't understand," he blurted. We couldn't wait forever. You're not. He stopped himself. But the damage was done. Claudia's eyes flashed. We planned carefully. You should have stayed in the water when you had the chance. I let her words hang between us, then smiled slowly. Every sentence, every admission was being etched onto tape, undeniable when played back. Their confidence was cracking. Desperation made their voices sharper, their defenses thinner. When I finally rose from the chair, I knew the tide had shifted. They thought they had cornered me, but every word out of their mouths was binding them tighter to the truth. The house was no longer theirs. It was mine again. And this time I had the proof to make it undeniable. It ended more quickly than I expected. Within 48 hours, Noah had delivered the recordings and documents to the authorities. Detectives came quietly, slipping through the back entrance of the townhouse while Gavin and Claudia sat across from me in the living room, still arguing about how to contain the damage. The knock on the door froze them. When the officers stepped inside, badges raised. Gavin's face drained of what little color remained. Claudia tried to protest, her voice rising in frantic denial, but the cuffs silenced her more effectively than anything I could have said. The charges were read in clipped tones: conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder. In time, investigators would add more. Evidence of the surrogacy clinic's falsified records surfaced, and with it, the truth about Lila Morris. Her death, once filed under complications, was now under scrutiny. She hadn't just been a surrogate. She had been a child, used and discarded. The courtroom was silent the day her name was spoken aloud, breaking through the sterile language of legal motions. Months later, when the trials ended, I returned to Beacon Hill. The townhouse had been restored to me, though it felt different, lighter, without the shadows Gavin and Claudia had cast. The nursery upstairs was no longer a symbol of fraud, but of a second chance. With the court's blessing, I adopted the boy and gave him the name Robert Lila Harwood. Robert for his grandfather, Lila for the mother who never had the chance to hold him. At night, when the house is quiet, I sometimes sit in the same armchair where I once confronted my betrayers. Robert's soft breathing carries from the next room, steady and reassuring. I know now that family isn't bound by birth or blood. It is proven in loyalty, in truth, in the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, what defines family: the fortune others try to steal, or the love you refuse to sell?